Hello, hello. I'm Sarah, joining you guys again to go over our Let Freedom Ring brand new 3-block design. Earlier today, we stitched out all of our blocks. I have our last block, which is our firework B block right here. I held off on trimming this because I wanted to trim it with you guys. So what we're going to do in this video is we are going to talk about trimming and how to remove the bulk from your seam allowance using our trimmer by George. We are also going to talk about pinning techniques to join your blocks together. I'll stitch a couple blocks together. I already stitched my top section and bottom section together, just this middle row left to stitch together. And then we will talk about how to add backing to your wall hanging. So I'm going to hop over to my other camera and we will start out with trimming. All right. So over here at the cutting table, I have our center block. So this block in particular, right in the center of our wall hanging, will have another block joined to each side. So we're going to trim every side the same way. If you have a border block, let me grab one of those. If you have a border block, you will trim it a little different, and we will talk about that right when I'm done with this one. But for each side that has a block joined to it, or that will have a block joined to it, you are going to use your Trimmer by George tool to trim that side to remove the bulk. So in this case, just our battleizer right up to that basting stitch. And then you'll trim the fabric on the top 1/4 inch from the basting stitch. So the Trimmer by George, if you've never seen it, is our acrylic ruler that has the crimped metal edge on it. And that metal edge is what protects the fabric on the front of your block when you're trimming right up to the basting stitch. So I'm just going to gently set my Trimmer by George on the metal edge and shimmy it underneath the fabric on the top of my block. I'll lay it flat, make sure that no fabric is peeking out. Just give a little gentle tug on your battleizer to get that metal edge as close as possible to the basting stitch. And then I'm going to use my 60mm rotary cutter to just trim that battleizer away. And now you are left with that side of our block. There is no more bulk in that where your seam allowance will be, and it's nice and clean cut, all of that extra battleizer removed. I'm going to go ahead and do that on my other sides as well, and you can see it right now. I'm trimming the opposite side of my block next, and I'll tell you about why in a moment. Setting my scraps off to the side. And so again, how we did that was we stand our Trimmer by George up gently on that metal edge, shimmy it underneath the fabric on the front of the block, and then lay it flat. Little gentle tug on our battleizer, and if no fabric is peeking out, we can use a 60mm rotary cutter to remove that excess battleizer. One last side. And you do want to make sure you're using a 60mm rotary cutter and not a 40, because there is a little extra height on the trimmer because of that metal edge. Okay, now that we have our battleizer trimmed right up to the basting stitch on all 4 sides, we are going to trim the fabric on the front 1/4 inch from the basting stitch. One more side. I like that with the Trimmer by George, I can use the same tool to trim my entire block just by flipping it over and using that acrylic ruler side. So here is firework block B, all trimmed up. And now, before we hop into pinning, I wanted to mention that border block. So this block is a border block, and it will have a block joined to the top, our left side, and the bottom side. On this side, our right side, it's going to have binding sewn to it. So it was trimmed a little different. So you can see these 3 sides, we removed that bulk from the seam allowance, and then on the side that will have the binding stitch to it, we just trimmed 1/4 inch through all layers from that basting stitch. So that's the difference with the border blocks. And then I said I would talk about why I trimmed my left side of my block and then flipped it over and trimmed the right side. So when I do that, that gives me kind of 2 equal size scraps that I can use. And instead of throwing these scraps away, all I need to do is go over to my machine, butt the straight sides up right next to each other, and then just use a zigzag stitch to join these two together. And I can keep doing that with my scraps until I have a piece that's big enough to put in my hoop, and I can just stitch right on top of that. And we call this Frankenbat. So just a really good way to keep from throwing so many scraps away. All right. So here is our B block. I'm going to go ahead and grab our border blocks. There's our right border and then our left border. So we need to join these 3 blocks together. So right now what we're going to do is we're going to jump right into a great pinning technique that you can use to make sure all of your match points line up perfectly when you join your blocks. And we use an anchor pin to do this. So I highly recommend that you try this. If you've never tried it, I think it's great. It keeps your blocks from getting out of alignment and shifting when you're pinning. So first, obviously, we're going to put right sides together. Actually, I'm going to back up a second. I want to talk about the match points first. So what you need to do in your blocks is find those match points. So on these 2 blocks, we have the 2 corners. So we have this corner and this corner. Those are obviously our match points. And then we also have where the quilting is going to line up. So we've got a few different places that we can pin those match points. So let's put right sides together. We're going to grab an anchor pin, and we're going to take our anchor pin and go directly through that corner right at the basting stitch. And then at the corresponding corner on the other block, we'll go directly through that corner. And you can see how my pin I didn't pin down into the block. It's just going straight through. And now I'm going to work my way toward that other corner. I've got another anchor pin. I see some quilting that I want to line up. So right at the basting stitch where my quilting is, I'm going to go directly through the block. And then in the corresponding part on the other block where my quilting is that I want to line up to, I'm going to go directly through right at that basting stitch. So let's do one more in this last corner. Directly through right at the basting stitch. Same thing on that other block. Okay, now I've got 1, 2, 3 anchor pins right here. I'm going to go ahead and grab another pin. And for this one, I'm going to go through the seam allowance right by my anchor pin and then back down and into my block. Now, once I've done that, I can go ahead and take this anchor pin out. So same thing next to my other anchor pin, through that seam allowance and then down into my block. Remove your anchor pin. Last one, through the seam allowance into my block, and take our last anchor pin out. So now I'm going to head over to the machine and I'm going to start stitching right at my corner basting stitch, might back it up a stitch or 2 and then come back forward, removing pins as I go. But I'm just stitching right on the basting stitch right until I get to that other corner. So I'll go do that really quickly. Okay, so I stitched right on that basting stitch, removing those pins as I went. And now we can open it up. And we did pretty good on those match points. You can see the quilting lines up nicely. Those basting stitches line up nicely. So our blocks are nice and even. And now all I need to do is go ahead and press our seams over to one side. And then I can add our left border block to this row. I would join those rows to our other ones. So after I get this row joined together, I'm going to use that same technique that I used with the pinning with the anchor pins. And I'm going to follow those same steps to pin our rows together and join those right along that basting stitch. You just want to make sure when you're joining rows together that you're pinning at the corner of each of the blocks. And then you're also finding some match points, which in this particular design is going to be your background quilting, as well as this blue stitching for the firework. So use that anchor point technique. I think it's great. It keeps your blocks from shifting as you're stitching and as you're pinning. It's fabulous. One thing I did want to mention when you're pressing, if you used wool in your block and you need to press your seam to one side. So on our block that we just joined, I just want to press these seams to one side. I didn't use wool, so I can just press as normal. If you used wool, I would recommend that you get a strip stick, which this is kind of just like a wood dowel that's cut in half. So it's got a flat side. So you lay it on the flat side, and then all you do is just lay your seam right over the top of that, and you can move your iron right along your seam, and you won't press the rest of your block flat. So just one thing to note if you decided to use wool. Okay, so we've got our blocks joined. And now the last step would be the assembly part. And this is typically, I think, joining the blocks and the assembly is oftentimes what we hear is the most intimidating for people, but it's really simple. Just use that pinning technique and then follow the instructions for how to add your one-piece backing. So right here, you can't see it all on camera, but I've got my one-piece backing that is cut to size. I just cut it to what the supply chart indicated I need to cut it to. I think it's 16 by 29, but double check your supply chart for that information. I've got my one-piece backing. I'm going to lay it right side down. So the right side of my fabric is facing down right now. For a project this size, you really don't need to tape your backing fabric taut or anything. Just give it a good press, and then you can lay it right side down. Now you're going to take, and now we are going to pretend. We pretend sometimes around here for demonstrations, maybe that we're using water-soluble thread when we're using red. Right now, we're going to pretend that I've joined all of my rows together. So you're going to take your joined blocks and you are going to lay them right side up, right on top of your backing fabric. Then you can use some quilting safety pins, and you would want to pin each block to that backing fabric. Just make sure that you're avoiding your seams. The next step that you're going to do is head over to your machine, and you can use an elongated serpentine stitch, and you'll just kind of stitch in the ditch with that serpentine stitch. It'll meander off it a little bit, and then you want to do that with your remaining seams. So just make sure you use that serpentine stitch along all of your seams, and then you'll just baste around the outside edges of your quilt and trim your backing fabric even, add your binding, and you are all set. So let us know if you guys have any questions in the comments, but that is how you would trim your blocks and then join them together and assemble them to come up with your final product, which is your Let It Ring 3-block wall hanging. Really fun, quick, easy project. I hope you guys had fun. And again, as always, let us know in the comments if you have any questions, and we will answer those for you. Bye-bye.